Good day. Today is Monday, 18th August 2025, and I am making this program on the eve of another summit meeting, this time a summit meeting which is due to take place this evening in Washington, D.C., to be precise, in the White House, when President of the United States, Donald Trump, will be meeting President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. And the topic of this discussion between Trump and Zelensky, which is supposed to last roughly 1 hour, is peace or possible peace or a peace initiative to achieve peace in Ukraine, or perhaps a return to war. Now, apparently, after this meeting with Trump and Zelensky takes place, there will be a plenary meeting, if I can call it that way, a plenary meeting in which Trump will be meeting the European leaders. And there's some discussion that the European leaders are in discussion with each other about which of them should act as the main spokesman in this meeting. Now, when I say the European leaders, I think that is precisely what we're talking about, because all of the most important people in Europe are coming to Washington today alongside Zelensky to give Zelensky moral support and political backing, and also to control him, to make sure that he doesn't melt down or throw a tantrum or behave as he did back in February, when he came to Washington in a defiant mood, causing the famous quarrel in the Oval Office, which of course we all remember. Anyway, when I say, to repeat again, the European leaders, Ursula von der Leyen is there, Costa, the President of the European Council, is there, Keir Starmer is there, Emmanuel Macron is there, Giorgia Meloni is there, Friedrich Merz is there. They're all there, and they're all going to be there to support President Zelensky. I forgot to mention Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, but of course he is there, as is Ursula von der Leyen. They will all be there, holding Zelensky's hands, ready to provide the comfort if the meeting with Trump does not go well, there to press their points, to give Zelensky as much support as they possibly can, and of course to plot and intrigue with the various neocon leaders in Washington, including Lindsey Graham, whom I shall come to shortly. Anyway, this, in my opinion, is going to be the key meeting that will perhaps shape the process over the next couple of weeks, and perhaps ultimately decide the outcome of the war. Now, to repeat again what I said in my program yesterday, if you disregard all the noise, as you should, the enormous amount of noise that has issued out of Europe especially, but to some extent from the United States also, over the last couple of days and couple of hours, the outcome of the diplomatic maneuvering of the last few weeks is that the United States has not imposed the bone-crunching sanctions on Russia that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the Senate were talking about, and which briefly Donald Trump seemed inclined to impose. And the United States has also agreed with the Russians that an interim ceasefire, a ceasefire freezing the conflict, leading to negotiations, in other words, a ceasefire that will freeze the conflict indefinitely on the current lines, that instead of such a ceasefire, which the Russians have consistently rejected, the way forward has to be a peace settlement, a proper negotiated peace with the Russians, and that necessarily means negotiations until that peace settlement is eventually agreed. That has been the Russian stance all along, and in Alaska on Friday, Donald Trump and the United States came round to that view. That is the only things that we can definitely say about the events of the last 2-3 weeks. Now, it is clear that over the course of various meetings, including the one in Alaska, the Americans and the Russians have been bouncing ideas off each other. The Americans, and I'm convinced it is the Americans, not the Russians, have suggested a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass, a ceasefire in Kherson and Zaporozhye if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass. My sense is that the Russians have not actually agreed to this, at least not so far, but they've certainly given indications that they would entertain it. There's probably been discussions about a ceasefire in the air, in the battle in the sky, the drone and missile offensives that the Russians have been undertaking against the Ukrainians, which, by the way, continue. There was another big Russian drone and missile strike across Ukraine last night. Hardly reported anymore. This has become such a commonplace now, and of course it's drowned out by the events in the diplomatic world. Anyway, there might be discussions about that too. There probably have been discussions about that too. There, I suspect, been far fewer discussions about security guarantees for Ukraine. My sense is that this probably originated out of European and Ukrainian demands over the course of the telephone call, the video conference, I should say, that Donald Trump had with the European leaders and with Zelensky last Wednesday on the eve of the Alaska summit. The Europeans and the Ukrainians appear to have pressed Trump to agree to security guarantees for Ukraine without, I suspect, giving the matter much thought. Trump suggested that he was open to that possibility. The idea appears to have been floated past the Russians at the Alaska summit. Reuters, in that dispatch which I discussed in my program yesterday, said that the Russians did not give a very clear response. They did indicate that they had no objection to security guarantees to Ukraine of some kind. I've already explained in previous programs that the original Istanbul Agreement of April 2022 did indeed envisage security guarantees for Ukraine. I will come back to that shortly. Anyway, the Reuters dispatch suggests that the Russians, perhaps having been taken a little by surprise by the Americans when this topic was brought up, were thinking of Istanbul, of the security guarantees that they'd agreed with the Ukrainians in Istanbul. Putin's words at the press conference in Anchorage, in which he said that obviously the Russians were concerned, were in agreement with Trump about the need to take steps to ensure Ukraine's future security, strongly suggests that it was the kind of security guarantees that the Russians agreed in Istanbul that the Russians had in mind. Anyway, that discussion has led to all sorts of confusion and muddle, as I discussed in my program yesterday. There's been lots of talk and more talk over the last 24 hours about security guarantees and about the Russians supposedly agreeing to security guarantees for Ukraine. And of course, adding to the confusion is a rather rambling interview that Steve Witkoff has recently given, in which Steve Witkoff gave yesterday, to be precise, in which Steve Witkoff tried to push back on claims that it was only the Americans who had made concessions in Anchorage, and said that amongst the matters that the Americans had brought up with the Russians, and about which the Russians seemed to be showing flexibility, was the question of security guarantees, and that Ukraine, as a result, stood likely to obtain security guarantees, which would be in some way like the Article 5 guarantees, Article 5 being the guarantees in the Washington Treaty, the founding treaty of NATO, but somehow would not be the same as the NATO guarantees. They would leave Ukraine outside NATO nonetheless. Now, as I explained in my program yesterday, given that there is an ongoing war in which the United States and the Europeans are not prepared to provide Ukraine with security guarantees because they do not want to fight the Russians, despite security guarantees in the way that they suggest being about giving some kind of guarantee to the Ukrainians in respect of a potential attack by the Russians. The Russians have a veto over this whole topic, and it's clear that over the last 24 hours, as the Russians have gradually come to understand that this debate about security guarantees in the West is taking on its own life, they have moved to try to counter some of the debates and discussions in the West and to stake out clearly their own position. And the Russian official who has spoken out about this is a Russian diplomat, senior Russian diplomat, Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative at international organizations in Vienna. And he has said that many EU leaders emphasize that the future peace agreement should provide reliable security guarantees for Ukraine. Russia agrees with this, but it has every right to expect that Moscow will also receive effective security guarantees. The West is making a mistake by not starting to discuss such a step with respect to Russia. Ulyanov, and this is from TASS, stressed that these guarantees should be much more reliable than the notorious promises about NATO's non-expansion to the east. So the Russians want to discuss this. They have their own views about this. They do not envisage clearly security guarantees extending beyond what was agreed in Istanbul, but they see this whole discussion within the context of the reordering, the renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe, what the Russians have been talking about ever since the autumn of 2021, when they produced 2 draft treaties to block further NATO expansion and basically to reorder the security architecture in Europe. 2 draft treaties that the United States and the NATO powers basically refused to negotiate on the substance of. Anyway, the Russians are clearly now staking out their position. They say, hold on, you can't go ahead and grant Ukraine security guarantees. First, you need to negotiate all of this with us. We will decide to a great extent what these security guarantees will consist of. And in fact, the security guarantees, which need to also ensure our security as well as Ukraine's, must mean a stop to NATO's eastward expansion and a reorganization, a recalibration of the security architecture in Europe. In other words, this is going to be a very, very complicated process, and we are very far from that point yet. And proper negotiations on this topic, as well as on all of the other topics, including, by the way, just to say, the ultimate status of Zaporozhye and Kherson region, which of course are part of Russian territory under the Russian constitution, and Ukrainian withdrawals from Donbass, and all of that all has to be discussed and negotiated properly. And those negotiations haven't even taken place. And for the moment, for the record, the Russian position continues to be officially that the 4 regions belong to Russia and that their status is not ultimately up for discussion. So just saying. So there's been a lot of talk, lots of discussions here. People taking the various ideas the Russians and the Americans have been bouncing off each other as agreements. But so far, the only clear agreement, and I'm going to suggest that this is the understanding that Putin was referring to in the press conference that he gave in Alaska. The only understanding, the only agreement, if you like, that exists between the Americans and the Russians is that there should not be a ceasefire and negotiations, but rather there should be negotiations leading to a peace settlement. And the idea of a ceasefire, in the meantime, has been dropped. As I said, there's been a huge amount of over-analysis of what was discussed in Alaska. Remember, it was only a 3-hour meeting, so it's inconceivable that Putin and Trump could have gone into a huge amount of detail. And clearly, as I said, there have been previous talks and discussions and exchanges of ideas, as always happens in a negotiation. But at the moment, the only agreement that we can speak of, the only understanding that Putin and Trump have come to, that we can be sure of, and in my opinion, probably the only understanding that there has been up to now, is that the Americans have agreed with the Russians that this whole conflict needs to be negotiated with a view to achieving a final, conclusive, peaceful resolution of it, without any ceasefire in the meantime getting in the way. A ceasefire that will lead to an indefinite freeze of the conflict, if it even takes place, which is something that the Russians have consistently ruled out and said that they do not want to see. So I just want to make all of this clear, again, in advance of the meeting that is going to take place today in Washington. Now, the Ukrainians do not like this idea at all. They do not want a situation where the war goes on and there are negotiations, and these negotiations ultimately lead to a final peace agreement. The reason they do not want that to happen is because the most that they are prepared to concede to at the present time is a freezing of the conflict so that they can rearm and re-equip and prepare for the next round. I don't think there's any serious doubt about this. Whereas, of course, if there is a final peace agreement, certain things will be locked in which it would be difficult to unpick. Ukraine's long-term status being one, the fact that it is outside NATO, the fact that the Russians want to see Ukraine agree to become a neutral, non-aligned state again, as was originally provided for in its constitution. The issue of territory, obviously, the status of the 4 regions. If there's a full peace agreement, that probably will mean that at least in some form, the Ukrainians will recognize that the Russians will have permanent control whilst this peace agreement remains in place over the territory that they control, which, by the way, might be the four regions, the entirety of the four regions. And of course, there could be other things, the status of the Russian language, the rights of Russian speakers, the rights of the Russian Orthodox Church, the situation with the ultra-nationalist forces, the denuclearization of Ukraine, the limits on the size of Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainians do not want to talk or negotiate about any of these things. Their objective is to freeze the conflict on the current lines, rebuild their army, and spin out the negotiations on all of these other topics for as long as possible, basically in exactly the same way that they did after the Minsk agreement was agreed back in February 2015. They see the outcome. From their point of view now, their objective now is a Minsk III, whereas that is precisely what the Russians want to avoid. They want a final resolution of the conflict. And that, by the way, is the fundamental difference. And of course, the Europeans support the Ukrainians. And that is why all of those European officials are going to Washington. The Europeans have gone out of their way to reiterate their strong support for the Ukrainians. They are talking again about Ukraine having a right to security guarantees so similar to NATO membership that they might as well be NATO membership. But the Europeans have gone further than that in the endless succession of meetings that have taken place over the last couple of hours. We've had reaffirmation of Ukraine's right to join NATO, reaffirmation of Ukraine's right to build up its armed forces to whatever level it can, reaffirmation of the determination of the European powers to deploy what they now call a reassurance force to Western Ukraine. All of the things that the Russians have emphatically and categorically rejected. So the big question about the meeting in DC, in Washington, in the White House is this: who will Donald Trump go with? In Anchorage, he seemed to accept the Russian logic. He knows that the Russians are winning the war, and that if things continue, if the war continues, they will eventually win the war. He knows that US military arsenals are critically depleted of key weapons, of Patriot missile interceptors, of all sorts of other military systems. He knows that the United States cannot go on indefinitely providing military support to Ukraine at the levels it has previously been doing. He knows that the sanctions and tariffs that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal were putting pressure upon him to impose on Russia and on its trading partners, and which he has at various times appeared to support himself. After all, he gave all those deadlines himself, all those ultimatums a few weeks ago. He knows that the Russians will have pulled the bluff on all of that, that they don't intend to stop the war simply because they are under threat of being sanctioned in this way. And he knows that Russia's trading partners, China and India and the other BRIC states, will call the bluff on these sanctions and tariffs as well, and that their only effect will be to make economic conditions in the United States worse than they are at the present time. And by the way, and for the record, economic conditions amongst America's allies, the European states, much worse still. He knows all of these things. That is why in Anchorage he agreed to the Russian demand. Of course, the Russians won't have presented it as a demand, but the Russian proposal, if you prefer, to use more moderate language, that we drop this idea of a ceasefire and move forward to negotiations for a direct settlement of the conflict, and that the ceasefire will come when the peace is finally negotiated. That is why Trump did that. That is why he invited Putin to Anchorage in the first place. That's why he met with him there. That's why he sent Witkoff to Moscow ahead of his own deadlines to impose these tariffs and sanctions. Well, Trump knows all of this. So is he going to stick with the position that he agreed with Putin in Anchorage? Or, alternatively, is he going to listen to what Zelensky is saying? Listen to what the Europeans are saying. Revert to talking about ceasefires. Repeat the threats of sanctions and tariffs against the Russians that he was making just 2 weeks ago. Go back, in other words, to the situation which existed before Anchorage, where the negotiations, the entire diplomatic process appeared to be in deadlock, and the United States was making threats which it was counterproductive for it to fulfill. This is the choice that Donald Trump needs to make. Perhaps ideally today, but certainly over the course of the next couple of days or weeks. Now, there are some indications that he's going to stick with the position he agreed with Putin in Anchorage. He's published a very interesting comment on Truth Social, which reads as follows. President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. Remember how it started. No getting back Obama given Crimea 12 years ago without a shot being fired. And this part is capitalized, no going into NATO by Ukraine. Some things never change. Exclamation mark. So Trump is basically saying to Zelensky, the things that you are demanding, a freeze of the conflict, security guarantees leading eventually to NATO entry, Crimea itself eventually back, or your refusal to accept that Crimea is Russian and is going to remain so indefinitely from this point on. This is all absurd. If you continue to make these kind of demands, the war will go on. If you really want to make peace, then just accept these realities. You are not going to get Crimea back. You are not going to get back into NATO. If you accept this, we can have peace. We can negotiate the terms with the Russians. The terms obviously will be harsher than the terms you appeared to have agreed in Istanbul back in 2022. You will have to forget about getting Crimea back. You might have to forget, in fact, you will have to forget about getting more of your territory back. You will certainly have to forget about NATO membership. And the security guarantees that you will get realistically are going to be far less than the equivalent of NATO security guarantees. They're going to be much more like the guarantees the Russians were offering you in Istanbul. By the way, on that topic, just quickly to return to it, just by way of parenthesis, an important fact, which of course nobody ever makes, about the security guarantees that had been agreed between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul in March and April 2022, is that the reason the Istanbul Agreement was never completed was because the Western powers, primarily the United States and Britain, refused to give Ukraine security guarantees if the rest of the Istanbul Agreement was put into effect. I can remember this vividly at the time. To repeat again, and it's a point which many people choose to overlook, Boris Johnson didn't just talk the Ukrainians into walking away from the Istanbul Agreement over the course of his trip to Kiev in April 2022. About 10 days before that visit, as reported at the time by the London Times, Boris Johnson had a telephone conversation with Zelensky, in which he told Zelensky that if Zelensky went ahead with Istanbul, if he agreed to the Istanbul proposals, the fact that Ukraine would not be joining NATO, the fact that Ukraine would agree to limits on the size of its armed forces, the fact that it would cede Crimea effectively to Russia. That wasn't exactly in Istanbul. But anyway, agree to Russia remaining in occupation, control of Crimea and territories in Donbass, subject to long-term negotiations about their status. If Zelensky agreed to all of that, then the United States and Britain would not give Ukraine security guarantees, because the Ukrainians would have compromised on the defense of their country. And of course, that in effect was a British-American veto on the April 2022 Istanbul Agreement, because it would have been very difficult, all but impossible, for Zelensky in that case to go ahead with the Istanbul Agreement, in circumstances where the only guarantor countries guaranteeing Ukrainian security would have been Russia and its friends, China, Brazil, Egypt, all those various countries. In order to sell Istanbul to the Ukrainian public, Zelensky, or certainly to the Ukrainian elite, Zelensky would have needed to show that he also had guarantees from the West. Just saying, it's a fact about this topic of security guarantees that many people have forgotten or don't even know. Anyway, coming back to Trump's Truth Social post, he is clearly telling Zelensky here, look, make the deal. You're not getting Crimea back. You're not getting into NATO. Whatever security guarantees you're going to get are not going to be the equivalent of NATO membership. Forget it. You might have to make further concessions too. But that is your pathway to peace. If you are not prepared to sign up to this, then you can continue to fight. That's your choice. But in that case, don't expect any further help from me or from the United States. Now, that's the message. That's the clear message of this Truth Social post. So that Truth Social post, taken by itself, might lead one to think that Trump is moving towards sticking with the understanding that he reached with Trump in Anchorage, Either we go for a full peace agreement, and the Ukrainians and the Europeans are signed up for this, so that there's a proper negotiation, a negotiation which is going to last, my guess is, several weeks or months. This is not going to be resolved within a few days. Certainly it's not going to be resolved by the 22nd of August, when Trump supposedly wants a second meeting between himself and Putin with Zelensky present to take place. Anyway, either there's going to be a proper negotiation leading to peace, or there's going to be a continuation of the war. If you stick to your current demands, you want a ceasefire, you want all your territory back eventually, you want NATO entry, you want unrestricted rights to increase the size of your armed forces, you want to organise and reorder your internal arrangements exactly as you please. In that case, the war will go on and the United States will no longer be involved. That is the implicit message of this Truth Social post. And there are some other indications that other American officials also see this as a make or break moment for Zelensky. That if Zelensky and the Europeans do not sign up to the American approach, then basically, if they want to continue with the war by themselves, in that case, they can, but they are on their own. Marco Rubio gave a much more interesting interview, in my opinion, than the one that Steve Witkoff gave. Rubio is, of course, a politician. He's been in Washington politics, involved in Washington politics, for very much longer than Witkoff has been. And he knows much better how to talk to the media than Witkoff does. Anyway, Rubio said many very interesting things about the war, but the thing that stood out to me, most important of all, was about the sanctions and the tariffs. He said that Russia is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, that already it has been sanctioned up to its eyeballs and even beyond. None of that has made Russian policy changed. It has not crashed the Russian economy in the way that many people in the West expected. It has certainly not led the Russians to make peace on America's terms, and imposing the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal is talking about, and which the Europeans also want to see. All that's going to do is it's going to destroy America's relationship with Russia, and it's going to prevent any sort of diplomatic move towards achieving peace in Ukraine. So, again, this comment from Rubio, which basically is saying that what many people in the West believe to be the great magic weapon that's going to force the Russians into capitulation, Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions, that simply isn't going to work. So that also suggests that some people in the United States, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance maybe, others no doubt also, are going to take the stance at this meeting tonight, saying that to Zelensky, look, either we sit down and negotiate with the Russians seriously this time, either we make sensible counter-proposals that the Russians might be interested in, like withdrawing from Donbass but holding on to Zaporozhye and Kherson, negotiating the kind of security guarantees with the Russians that the Russians will not take exception to and won't reject outright. Unless we do that, if you want to go ahead still and insist on ceasefires, as you are currently doing, insist on all of the things that have been talked about at such fantastic length over the last few months, NATO membership, EU membership, security guarantees leading up to NATO membership, more weapons supplies, more money, all of those things. If you want to stick to that, well, you're clearly not interested in peace. You are still committed to the war. And if you want to fight the war, well, it's up to you. You can go ahead and do it. You can get whatever support you can get from your European friends. But we ourselves are going to walk away. There's a third indication that the Americans this evening might decide to take that stance. And that is that there are reports circulating today, and indeed yesterday also, that the Trump White House has made it very clear that this time, when Zelensky meets with Trump, he must turn up in a proper suit and tie. Unless he does so, the meeting with Trump simply won't take place. The Americans have consistently taken the stance that not only is Zelensky's battlefield Che Guevara camouflage outfit disrespectful to the Americans, but it is also a sign that he remains committed to war and sees himself as a war leader, not as a peacemaker, which is what the Americans want him to be. So you could put all of that together and come up with a convincing argument that Trump is going to stick to his position, the one that he agreed with Putin in Anchorage. He's going to tell Zelensky, the game's up now, the war must end. You must start negotiating seriously with the Russians. We will be there to help you do that, but it will be a peace which will leave Ukraine outside NATO. Crimea is lost, Donbass is lost, other territories might be lost too. You might have to accept other terms which you won't like, but we will negotiate with you and we will see whether perhaps we can improve the terms somewhat from these very harsh terms that the Russians have set out. If you won't accept that, well, fine, it's up to you. You're on your own then. The Russians will fight the war and win, and it'll be for you to decide. It will be for you to decide which of the two pathways it is going to be. Either you go along with what we're proposing, or we walk away. Unfortunately, I say this because I definitely, personally, believe that this is the outcome that the United States would take. Look at it from the interests, just purely the narrow interests of the United States. They're out of weapons. Their sanctions and tariffs aren't going to work. They're admitting to this themselves. Their weapons are depleted. Ukraine is losing. What is in it for the Americans if they continue with what you might call the Biden EU UK orthodoxy of continuing to support Ukraine for as long as Ukraine wants, for as long as it takes, in other words? Anyway, unfortunately, there is no guarantee that Donald Trump will take this line. I say that because going back to what Byron York, the reporter for Washington Examiner, who's written an interesting biography about Donald Trump, and Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 have both been saying, the problem with Trump is he goes into meetings with people like Zelensky, and even more, I suspect, with the Europeans, and instead of putting his foot down and telling them the situation as it is, and telling them to get lost if they start to push back against him, he on the contrary, tries to meet them halfway. He tries to see if there's some way that he can bring them along or persuade them of his point of view and way of thinking. And in the process, he starts saying things which it would be much better if he did not say. As I've already discussed, I think he made a mistake when he spoke to the Europeans on Wednesday about talking about security guarantees. He should have said to them straightforwardly that this is a topic for another day, that he's not prepared to discuss it then, certainly not before he spoke with Putin in Anchorage. It's a typical example, as I said, of how Trump loses control by trying to be accommodating to whoever it is he speaks with. There's been a lot of pushback. They had a lot of pushback, and so did we on the Duran. Well, we said some months ago that Trump has a habit of echoing what the last person has said to him. I think increasingly more and more people are coming to see this. So if Trump also says, well, ceasefire might not be such a bad idea after all, we might revert to that idea again. Rubio has already done that. But if Trump starts to go there too, one could see how we could all slide back, as I said, to the position that existed pre-Anchorage. If he starts talking about, yes, the sort of security guarantees really ought to be at least as good as NATO membership, maybe even better for Ukraine than NATO membership. And European troops in Ukraine, well, we have absolutely no problem with that at all. That seems like a great idea. Let's go forward with that. If we get into that kind of situation, then we're on a slippery slope. Likely the next meeting between Putin and Trump will not take place, and we could find ourselves back in a situation where there really is no progress, and we are back to a war situation, an indefinite war situation, without the United States having walked away. And in that kind of scenario, we are inevitably going to be back into the whole language and discussion of sanctions. Even as I've been making this program, the British media are saying that the Europeans are going to press Trump this evening to impose further sanctions on Russia. And Lindsey Graham has given another very disturbing interview. And the person who has covered it best, the first quick take on it was Eve Smith on naked capitalism, and Lindsey Graham is back to his old games, as far as I can see. He again praises Trump with faint praise. It's all, as I said, spoken with a forked tongue. He again is talking about sanctions and tariffs. He's coming up with hopelessly wrong claims about the Russian economy. Most of their income comes from oil and gas and all of that. Most of their export revenue is from energy sales. This is true. But if he's talking about budget revenue, that is simply not true. It hasn't been true, as I've discussed, for a very long time now. But anyway, he persists in trotting out all of those old myths again. And of course, he's now got another new idea, discussed at length by Eve Smith. Declare Russia a terrorist state. Bring up the topic of Russia's abduction of children. There's a letter that the president's wife, Melania, has written to Putin, which was passed on to Putin by Trump, talking about the importance of children. It's quite a moving letter in a kind of a way. It doesn't mention Ukraine or the war exactly, and it certainly doesn't mention children and the alleged or claimed Russian abduction of children in Ukraine, which is, of course, the topic of this great case that's been brought against Putin in person at the International Criminal Court. But, one can sense that Melania is probably thinking about that, and I doubt that she knows much beyond the headlines, and clearly she's moved about this. So Lindsey Graham, homing in on this, knowing that this is, of course, something that worries Trump's wife. He's bringing all this up again. So on the strength of that, declare Russia a terrorist state. Say that Russia is a terrorist state, which is a legal definition in the United States. That, of course, makes interactions between the United States and Russia all but impossible. There's no possibility of further meetings between the Russians and the Americans like the one we've seen in Alaska. It's probably true to say that declaring Russia a terrorist state doesn't entirely preclude high-level summit meetings. After all, Donald Trump has met Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and North Korea is one of the countries that the United States legally defines as a terrorist state. Just saying. But it's difficult to imagine any of the discussions and debates and plans and talk about future economic agreements between Russia and the United States that were apparently talked about in Anchorage ever taking place if Russia is indeed declared a terrorist state. I've come round to the view about Lindsey Graham that his ultimate objective here, quite apart from the fact that he wants to reaffirm his status in the eyes of his voters in South Carolina as the arch hawk and the super patriot of the United States, and also as Mr. MIC in the Senate, if I can put it like that. I got to the view that in practical terms, what Lindsey Graham is really trying to work towards is a situation where there is a complete rupture in relations between the United States and Russia altogether. He's less, I think, interested in victory in Ukraine, which I suspect even he now realizes is unachievable. But he wants to maintain an indefinite conflict between the United States and Russia. He absolutely does not want to see a rapprochement of any kind between Russia and his own country, the United States. Why he feels this way about Russia, I'm not going to try and guess. Of course, many people in the United States don't like Russia, and Lindsey Graham is hardly unique in that respect. So maybe one shouldn't try and explore this too far. But certainly, if things do go in that direction, then it's very difficult to see any sort of rapprochement between the United States and Russia ever taking place. But anyway, that's what Lindsey Graham is talking about. To repeat again, if Donald Trump starts to give ground from the clear position that he took in Anchorage, that there has to be a full negotiated settlement, negotiated with the Russians, that ceasefires, freezes, all of that, all of the Kellogg ideas are bad ideas that will result in indefinite war. And if the Ukrainians and the Europeans don't want to accept that. That's their business. But the United States doesn't have to indulge them anymore and can walk away. If Trump now retreats from that, if he starts to give ground or too much ground to these people, if he starts talking about ceasefires again and freezes of the conflicts and long-term negotiations and all of those kind of things, then, as I said, we see that Lindsey Graham is back in contention again. He's back with his sanctions, his bone-crushing sanctions, his tariffs, his secondary tariffs against the US's trade partners, and of course he can cap it all by having Russia declared a terrorist state, about which of course the Europeans will be enthusiastic. So a lot of people are projecting forward to this summit meeting today in Washington. They are saying that this is Zelensky's great test. It's make or break for Zelensky and for Ukraine and for Europe. I don't actually agree with that. I think the person who's going to be tested most tonight, this evening, is going to be Donald Trump. Either he stands firm, makes decisions which I suspect he understands now are both in America's interests and ultimately his own. Either he is prepared, in other words, to face down the wrath of Zelensky and the Europeans and to cope with whatever tantrums Zelensky throws, or he starts doing what he has repeatedly done up to now, tried to meet them halfway, in which case, as I said, he will start to slip and slide away from anchorage and the war will continue. And he will fall back into the same trap he was in before he sent Witkoff to Moscow. Now, there continues to be a view that what will instead happen is that the Americans will come back and they'll make demands of the Russians and they will ask the Russians to make the concessions and that Vladimir Putin will make the concessions and that we will end up getting Minsk III. This is something that always comes up whenever there is any kind of dialogue between Trump and Putin. Whenever Trump calls Putin, for example, whenever American and Russian officials meet, whenever Witkoff goes to Moscow, and of course in advance of the meeting in Alaska, there is always the fear that at some point Putin will yield. He never has done. He's never, as I've said many times, conceded on anything up to now. And if you go to the atmospherics of that meeting in the Kremlin, at which he was reporting on the outcome of the meeting in Alaska, you could see that he was faced with a room of stony-faced officials, the various members of the Russian security and political system, and he has to justify to them the various steps he is taking, and these people show themselves in no mood to compromise either. I've never got the sense that Putin is interested in the kind of concessions that people fear that he's going to make, and I certainly don't believe that the people that he has to ultimately report to, the people that he met, as I said, in the Kremlin yesterday, that these people are in any mood to compromise either. So, to repeat again, it is up to Trump. If he thinks that Putin will bend, well, he didn't bend in Anchorage, and I don't believe he's going to bend in future. If Trump wants to go ahead and impose his sanctions and tariffs, it's not going to turn out well for him. And the Russians will continue with the special military operation exactly as they have done. So the person who, it seems to me, faces the big test today is Donald Trump. I have no certainty, I have no foreknowledge about what is going to happen. My constant feeling about Trump is that he does get easily influenced by people. Eventually, sometimes he does come to realize that the advice they're giving him is advice that he should not have listened to in the first place. But if I said that I was confident that he would hold his ground in the meetings this evening, I would be saying much more than I know, and I would be talking with far greater confidence than I actually have. Now, that leads me now to a discussion of the military situation on the front lines. Now, as I discussed yesterday, briefly in my video yesterday, there has been a huge amount of fog of war about the situation in Pokrovsk. We now have a little bit of clarity about the situation there. First of all, it is now clear that the Ukrainians have indeed recaptured the village of Zoloty Kolodyas. Maybe the Russians are still close to it, as the Russian Defense Ministry said yesterday, but the Ukrainians are in control. They provided video footage showing men from the 79th Airborne Division in Zoloty Kolodyas. However, elsewhere we've also had other video footage, and it is starting to look as if the Russians have held on to at least some, perhaps most of their gains in the breakthrough that they achieved north of Pokrovsk a few days ago. Firstly, it looks as if the Russians have indeed probably captured the village of, I believe it is called Kucheri Yar, which is located to the south of Zoloty Kolodyas. I think it's a smaller village than Zoloty Kolodyas itself, but it looks as if the Russians are indeed in control of it. And apparently that is the regular Russian army that has arrived there. It looks as if the Russians have also successfully repelled the Ukrainian counterattacks close to ODYSEE. The Ukrainians were claiming yesterday that they'd recaptured positions in central Pokrovsk, but there is no video footage that confirms this, and it looks as if, on the contrary, it is the Russians who continue to make progress in other positions to the north of Pokrovsk, and including in the area around ODYSEE. So a Ukrainian counterattack, which has recovered some ground, given that we're talking about a Ukrainian counterattack with two of Ukraine's best brigades, the 79th Brigade and the 12th Azov Brigade, but with other important Ukrainian brigades as well involved as well. Apparently, the total Ukrainian force in the area involved forces drawn from as many as 6 Ukrainian brigades. So we're probably looking at a force of between 10 and 20,000 men, to guess. It would have been unsurprising if the Ukrainians had not recovered some ground, just saying. But it looks as if so far they have not achieved any decisive outcome, and that it is in fact the Russians who are consolidating their positions north of Pokrovsk. As I said, Kucheri Yar, this village, if I've got the name correctly, which they have captured, it is, as I said, advantageous to the Russians that they control it. And it seems that they're also continuing to make attempts to capture these other villages to the east of these breakthrough positions in order to thicken out the advance that they have now achieved on this territory. So anyway, that's the first thing I wanted to say about the fighting there. There are reports that because of this major redeployment of Ukrainian forces to try to contain the Russian breakthrough north of Pokrovsk, that the situation for the Ukrainians elsewhere is deteriorating fast. And there are reports that the Russians have advanced west of the village of Prechenye, which they now control, and that they have now entered and consolidated positions in Konstantinovka itself. This is the town of Konstantinovka, and that the battle for Konstantinovka itself, the storming operation for Konstantinovka itself, has now begun. It's probably a big and complex battle that is going to play out over the next couple of months. I don't expect Konstantinovka to fall very quickly, though who knows. But anyway, the battle for Konstantinovka has begun, and there are reliable reports. There's been no video confirmation, I should make this clear, but there are reliable reports that the Russians are indeed now in Konstantinovka itself. Perhaps the most dramatic news, however, continues to come from the Syrsky area. It seems that not only have the Russians successfully captured the village of Serebyanka, north of Syrsky, but they are apparently in the process of clearing the various Ukrainian positions to west of Serebyanka on the Seversky Donetsk River, and they appear to be advancing also towards another small town called Dronivka, which is located in this area also. So it's a complex battle, but it looks as if the noose around Syrsky is tightening if the Russians were indeed to capture Dronivka. Then Syrsky would already be, in effect, surrounded. And with the Russians already in control of Torske to the north of the ostrich farm, which is located, the ostrich farm as it appears on my Google map, just to say, which is located to the west of the Serebyanka forest, which the Russians have now mostly taken control of. Well, if the Russians push south from Torske, past this ostrich farm, and take Yampol, even as they're pushing eastwards from Serebyanka to take Dronivka. Well, as I said, we're talking about a cauldron for the Ukrainian troops in Syrsky, and in spite of everything, I don't seriously expect the Ukrainians to risk a cauldron in Syrsky itself. Now, saying all of this, there's also been a very, very interesting interview which has been given by the Ukrainian military chief, General Syrsky. And I think it's fair to say that this was, by Syrsky's standards, a deeply pessimistic interview. Firstly, he talked about the Ukrainian counterattacks in the Sumy region. Now, there's been a huge amount written about these counterattacks. The Ukrainians have at various times spoken very optimistically about these counterattacks in Sumy region. They've talked about Ukraine's success in capturing a village called Kondratyevo, and supposedly another village in this area as well, whose name I've forgotten, by the way. Anyway, Syrsky has now admitted that the Ukrainian counterattack in Sumy region has failed. And that's his words, apparently. He says that the Ukrainians have failed to drive the Russians back in Sumy region. The Russians are entrenched in Sumy region and are in a position to make further advances there. So at the moment, if we talk about Sumy region, it's a stalemate. The Russians still haven't captured Yunakovka, but it was the Ukrainians who were trying to counterattack there. Syrsky also spoke about how the Russians are conducting attrition against the Ukrainians, how the Russians have been launching attacks across the entire combat line against the Ukrainians, how the Ukrainians are unable to hold back the Russians in the face of these multiple Russian attacks. And though he didn't really go into the details, it's not difficult to get the sense that he was talking about the Ukrainians being desperately short of manpower now to hold their positions. And then, of course, because he can't admit to a eventual collapse of the Ukrainian front lines because of lack of men, he said that the robots will save the situation. We've heard lots about the drone walls that the Ukrainians were relying upon, even though it is now universally admitted that the Russians now have the advantage in the drone warfare in the sky, not just the Duran drones, but on the battle lines as well. And, well, it looks like robots, ground robots, are also going to win the battle for the Ukrainians as well. And surprise, surprise, we've seen film of some kind of tracked vehicle moving along a street in a village called Vesolye, which is another one of the villages that the Ukrainians reoccupied north of Pokrovsk. It's located, I believe, to the northeast of Zoloty Kolodyas. Anyway, we see tracked vehicles there, a tracked vehicle there, and there's all sorts of claims that the Ukrainians recaptured this village relying entirely on drones. The difficulty with that is, of course, that a few days ago, right at the start of the Ukrainian counterattacks in Pokrovsk, I seem to recall the Ukrainians providing footage of their infantry fighting in this very same village, and even not only recapturing the village, but even capturing some Russian reconnaissance troops who were stationed in that village. So what I think has happened, and this is my own guess, of course, I can't say because I am not physically there, is that the Ukrainians have put on a show. They are putting on a show. They've shown a robot, a tracked vehicle. Robots of this kind, by the way, have existed since the Second World War. The Germans used to have drones, remote-controlled tankettes during the Second World War. You can find a lot about this on YouTube if you really want to explore far enough, and elsewhere on the internet too. One of them, from memory, was called the Goliath, but I might be completely wrong about that. Anyway, the Ukrainians put on a show. They gave us video footage of this machine moving up the road, claiming that this machine and others like it had recaptured this village, except that I believe that this was all done after the village had been captured, and it's basically all intended for the cameras in advance of the meeting with Donald Trump and the Americans today in Washington. And we've had other footage as well. We've had a lot of information about the Russians' success in destroying Ukraine's Sun missile program. I said earlier over the course of this program that the Russians had launched another big drone and missile strike. And as it happens, the Russian Defense Ministry has recently said, as over the last couple of hours said, that they destroyed another warehouse housing Ukrainian Sun missiles. But don't worry, even if the Sun missile has been completely destroyed, Ukraine has an even better missile. This is called the Flamingo, and we now have footage of it inside a factory. And this is a cruise missile with a range of thousands of kilometers, and the Ukrainians are going to be able to deploy it and launch strikes anywhere across Russia. Now, I'm not able to assess the truth of any of this. I've seen one photograph of this cruise missile. To me, I have to say, with my very poor and defective eyesight, at least close range eyesight, it looked a little bit, and I have to say this again, like this missile that the Ukrainians were displaying, the Flamingo. It looked a little bit like, or it reminded me a little bit of a German V1 Doodlebug from the Second World War. I accept that this is just probably my own distorted vision of this thing. No doubt the Ukrainians do have some kind of a program to build a cruise missile like this. It might be that it even exists, but I doubt that it is going to have any effect against the very advanced Russian air defense system that exists now. Again, I suspect that the Ukrainians are unrolling the picture of this missile. They're talking about all of the robots in Veselye. They are giving us stories about successful counterattacks in Pokrovsk, which seem to go well beyond the realities, both in Pokrovsk city itself and north of Pokrovsk, because, of course, they have to try and persuade the Americans that Ukraine really isn't losing the war. Things are not as bad as the Americans might think. The Russians are only advancing slowly. They've only captured 1% more territory in 1% of Ukraine's 1991 territory over the last, I can't remember how many weeks or months it is. The British Defense Ministry, which is also, as I said in my program yesterday, assisting this Ukrainian narrative, says it will take the Russians another 4 years to capture Donbass. It's not difficult to see that this is first and foremost a propaganda operation intended, I suspect, to influence Donald Trump and to win over the Americans. And to say it clearly, I don't criticize the Ukrainians for doing this sort of thing. Propaganda, to repeat it again, is a part of war. It's always been so. The Ukrainians are very good at it. The Russians, by the way, are not. Just to say, there's a big discrepancy between the Ukrainians and the Russians here. So the Ukrainians should not be faulted for doing this sort of thing. But again, one needs a level head and one needs to understand what the Ukrainians are actually doing. Now, having said that the Russians are not good at this sort of propaganda, I should say that I've had an awful lot of information about the effect of the Oreshnik strike on the factory in Dnipro back in November. And I've had a very detailed amount of information about what actually happened to this factory. And perhaps here it's a misnomer, because I understand that the Yuzhny combine is not so much a single factory as a whole series of industrial plants and factories and warehouses, and by the way, underground warehouses as well. Many of them located underground, or at least it was. And anyway, the summary of it is that it is exactly as I said. The entire complex has been essentially destroyed. There's been massive amounts of damage done. Apparently, the plant played a significant role in repair of armored vehicles, Ukrainian armored vehicles, and that has basically now ended. One report I've received, the main report I've received, says that in fact it's a misconception that the Sapsan project was actually launched at this factory. The Sapsan project was actually mostly conducted in Europe and was only transferred to Ukraine in March of this year. But pretty much all other work at the factory has stopped because the damage that's been done has been so extensive. And I've been told that the Western powers have been trying to send their people to the factory. They've been trying to carry out post-Oreshnik damage assessments and to find information about the weapon used in order to try to understand how the Oreshnik works, with limited success, it seems, just to say. But the overall assessment is that the plant is devastating. And I've been given some information about the actual active workforce at the plant now. And I'm not going to provide details of that, but it does seem as if staffing levels in the factory, in the plant, have been, well, if I was to say drastically reduced, I would be understating things. It is much worse than that. So it looks as if the Oreshnik really did destroy the factory. Now, any other country other than Russia would be talking about this. Look at the way in which the United States, Donald Trump, have been talking about the attack on the Fordow facility in Iran, for example. But this being the Russians, they've remained tight-lipped about the damage that the Yuzhny plant has actually suffered, despite the fact, as I said, that damage is devastating. Well, anyway, there it is. Maybe the Russians are right. Maybe what has actually happened matters more in the end than the presentation of it. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with that, but perhaps in fairness, this is just my perspective, because Russian secrecy makes it much more difficult sometimes for me to do my work. But anyway, there it is. A key meeting is going to happen this evening. And as I said, it's not Zelensky who is going to be tested. It is going to be Donald Trump. Will he face Zelensky down? Zelensky's not going to change his position, not in advance of this meeting. Is he going to face Zelensky down? Is he going to face the Europeans down? He's on a slippery slope if he doesn't. And that's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.